Good morning, everybody. Today we shall be talking about Langston Hughes and his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Langston Hughes, 1901 to 1967, is an American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and columnist from Missouri. An innovator of a new literary art form called jazz poetry, Langston Hughes is best known as the leader of the Harlem Renaissance. Actively participated from 1942 to 1962 in the civil rights movement, Langston Hughes published in 1921 in The Crisis, the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. His poetry, as well as fiction, portrayed the lives of the working class of blacks in America. Lives he portrayed as full of struggle, joy, laughter, and music. The Negro Speaks of Rivers is one of the famous free verse poems about African people and their life before and after leaving their land. It was published in 1921 in the journal The Crisis. The poem presents the voice and memory of the Africans who were forced into slavery, including the time when Abraham Lincoln fought to abolish it. The speaker speaks from the depth of his heart and provides glimpses of his heritage, memories attached with ancient rivers in Africa. There are a number of rivers mentioned in this poem. The very first is Euphrates. Euphrates is the longest and one of the most historically important rivers of Western Asia. Together with the Tigris, it is one of the two defining rivers of Mesopotamia. The very word means the land between the rivers. Originating in the Armenian highlands of eastern Turkey, the Euphrates flows through Syria and Iraq to join the Tigris in the Shat al Arab, which empties into the Persian Gulf. In the Taurus Mountains and the upper part of Syrian Euphrates Valley, early permanent villages such as Abu Huraira, at first occupied by the hunter-gatherers and later by some of the earliest farmers, became established from the 11th millennium BCE onwards. So civilization began with Euphrates. The second river that is mentioned in the poem is River Nile. Nile is a major north flowing river in northeastern Africa and is the longest river in Africa. The third river mentioned in the poem is the Congo. The Congo, formerly known as the Zaire River, is the second longest river in Africa, as well as the second largest river in the entire world by discharge volume, following only the Amazon. Mississippi is the next river that is mentioned in the poem. The Mississippi River is the second longest river and chief river of the second largest drainage system on the Northern American continent. From its traditional source of Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota, it flows generally south 3,730 kilometers to the Mississippi River Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. The city that is mentioned in the poem is New Orleans. New Orleans is a consolidated city parish located along the Mississippi River in the southeastern region of the United States of America of Louisiana. Founded in 1718 by French colonists, New Orleans was one of the territorial capital of New Orleans in 1840, was the third most populous city in the United States. Inability to find labor was the most pressing issue in the early French colony. The colonists turned to African slavery to make their investments in the Louisiana profitable. In the late 1710s, the international slave trade imported enslaved Africans. This led to the biggest shipment in 1716, where several trading ships appeared with slaves as cargo to the local residents in the 1 year span. Louisiana slave culture had its own distinct Afro-Creole society that called on the past cultures and the situation for slaves in the New World. The poet thus gives a history of human settlements, first in Mesopotamia of the Euphrates, on the banks of River Euphrates, to the Orleans on the banks of River Mississippi, covering the entire human history throughout the poem. Let's read the poem with this background. I have known rivers. I have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to the Orleans, and I have seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I have known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. The Negro Speaks of River is a poem written in 1920 by the American poet Langston Hughes, one of the key poems of a literary movement called the Harlem Renaissance. The Negro Speaks of River traces back history from the beginning of human civilization to the present, encompassing both triumphs like the construction of the Egyptian pyramids and horrors like the American slavery. The poem argues that the black soul has incorporated all of this historical experience and in the process has become deep. The poem thus suggests the black culture identity is continuous, that it stretches across the violence and displacement of slavery to connect with the past, and that black people have made vital yet often neglected contributions to human civilization. This poem is written from the perspective of an old soul who tries to establish a link between the past and the present. Thus, it is a representative of the entire human history. He uses rivers as the symbols to reflect the African experience and history. Additionally, he says that his soul is as deep as a river, implying that he has seen the experience tremendous changes in the human civilization. Also, he speaks about his past activities near the Euphrates, the Congo, and the Nile, which provide a clue to his philosophical approach, love of nature, and the origin of his race. 2. The river of Mississippi, leading them into slavery. The major themes that are spoken in the poem The Negro Speaks of River are pride, heritage, and nature. The poet talks about the original and historical existence of the African race. By using the reference of rivers, he says that the African race is deeply detached to the knowledge that is as old as the ancient rivers. Also, the mood of the poem suggests that the speaker takes pride in his color, ancient culture, and race. Blackness, perseverance, and cultural identity are the next themes as discussed in the poem. The Negro speaks of river stretches from the earliest moments of human civilization all the way to the American slavery, emphasizing that black people have both witnessed and participated in the key moments of human history. In the face of centuries of slavery and oppression in America, the poem's speaker asserts the perseverance of black cultural roots. The poem argues that people of African descent have not simply been present for all the human history, they have been a guiding force shaping civilization. In this sense, the poem is an ode to the black perseverance. The speaker of the poem acts as a representative figure. The title, The Negro Speaks of River, not a Negro, but the Negro, In this sense, the speaker models how he or she thinks the entire black identity and the entire black community as a whole should relate to his history and culture. As an almost mythical figure, the speaker emphasizes the depth of his or her experience, which turns out to represent the entire history of the black people. The speaker has known rivers ancient as the world, in inverted commas, and bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young, inverted commas. The Euphrates is a river in the Middle East associated with an area called the cradle of civilization, where human agriculture first began. As such, the speaker is saying he or she was present at the very start of human history, implying that the black people have helped shape the world as we know it. Invoking this deep history establishes the fact that the black experience extends as far as back as any other people's, creating a profound sense of community and connection between black people. In fact, the speaker has known rivers older than the flow of human blood in human veins. I quote from the text, suggesting that black history existed even before the human existence. This connects the speaker to the natural world. On one hand, such a connection could be considered problematic since racist discourses often oppose civilized white populations to natural or uncivilized black peoples. Because of these racist ideas, Hughes himself veered away from such characterizations in his later work. On the other hand, this connection can be seen as asserting a sense of wisdom and peace, such as when the Congo lulls the speaker to sleep. I quote from the poem, in the face of slavery and oppression, which the poem alludes to later on. In addition to the speaker's deep historical sense and experience, he or she has also witnessed recent events such as the singing of the Mississippi, a river on the American continent, thousands of miles away from the Euphrates, when Abraham Lincoln went down to New Orleans. I quote from the text. The line alludes to a famous trip of Abraham Lincoln took down the Mississippi as a young man, which exposed him to the evils of slavery. The speaker invokes these examples to show the breadth of black experience, which includes moments of triumph like building the pyramids and monuments, and moments of trial and tribulations like slavery and the Civil War in America. In all these movements, the black experience has helped define the course of history. As the speaker outlines these distant, disparate experiences, he or she stresses that they are not disconnected events. They form one uninterrupted experience like the flow of the river. Rivers represent continuity. They cannot be chopped into discrete chunks. Furthermore, the speaker's experience is deep like a river, suggesting permanence, perseverance, and inner strength. Black people have persevered through the most difficult times. Like a river, black history keeps flowing. This argument holds special importance for the American black community for two related reasons. First, the slave trade cut off black people from their homes, their cultures, their families, and ultimately their history. Yet, the speaker asserts a continuous history despite the cutting off. Second, the American narratives of history have usually focused on the white people, effectively erasing black experience. So, in presenting the speaker's knowledge as stretching across continents and historical periods, the poem portrays a different narrative, one that acknowledges the black history as well. The speaker argues that black identity and accomplishment are so powerful they can cross the gaps that slavery created, reconnecting the lost ancestors and traditions. In this way, the poem proudly portrays the depth of the black historical experience. The lines of the poem are worth mentioning here for a proper understanding of the poem. The lines 1 and 2 talk about I have known rivers, which is a refrain used in the poem as well. The first two lines, "The Negro speaks of rivers," establishes the poem's theme and its formal pattern. The poem begins with the speaker directly addressing the reader, speaking about his or her experience. "I have known rivers," the speaker claims. At first, this does not seem to be all that impressive or revelatory. After all, more or less everyone has seen a river. But over the course of the poem's 10th line, the speaker's apparently unremarkable statement will transform into a bold assertion about the black cultural identity and history. As the poem progresses, all three words in the poem's opening line, "I," "know," and "river," take on new expanded meanings. The line 4 talks about "my soul has grown deep like the rivers." The speaker shows that his soul has grown deep like the rivers when he recounts the experiences that connect him to his heritage. Each river he names in the poem has a connection to his heritage. He is able to look back and see the experiences that led him and his people to this point in their history. It's a rich heritage that includes both good times and bad. There is honor and loss in it. For example, he talks about bathing in the Euphrates at the dawn of time, but also about his people being enslaved to build pyramids in Egypt with Nile, and slowly talks of Mississippi and slavery in America. The last two lines are worth mentioning here, taking the theme of the poem further. He says, "Ancient dusky rivers, my soul has grown deep like the rivers." The speaker's soul is intimately connected to his racial identity, an identity which has emerged out of several millennia, from the dawn of civilization in the Fertile Crescent to present day America. At various stages in Black history, rivers have played a crucial role in determining the day to day rhythms of life. The river is a symbol of permanent settlement, an attachment to the soil, whether by the Great Congo River or in ancient Egypt or on the banks of Nile. It also has got great historical significance. It's associated on the speaker's mind with the time when a young Abraham Lincoln traveled down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, a momentous journey that exposed him to the largest slave marketplace in the country. But aside from its deeper cultural and historical significance, the river nourishes the soul with its incredible beauty, as when the muddy bosom of the Mississippi turns golden in the sunset in the last line. The stanza pattern that is used in the poem is free verse, which is the most favorite of Langston Hughes. "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" is a highly end-stopped poem written in free verse. Indeed, it contains no enjambments. Free verse poems usually rely on enjambment or run-on line to create surprise and rhythm. However, the speaker of "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" is not particularly interested in that kind of surprise. Instead, the poem dramatizes the speaker's deep, continuous knowledge of Black life and culture, stretching back to the beginning of human history. There is no need for surprise or uncertainty here because the speaker already knows everything he or she needs to know. The poem's end stops thus contribute to the sense that the speaker is self assured, confident in his or her experience and knowledge. "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" has no set rhythm and rhyme and metrical pattern. Sometimes its lines are short, sometimes they are very long. For instance, the first line of the poem, "I have known rivers," contains just 4 syllables, while the second line has 23 syllables. As a result, the poem's lines move like a river's current, sometimes full of energy and rushing forward, and sometimes running slowly and softly. Hughes also experiments with the length of its 5 stanzas. The stanzas 2 and 5 are only a single line, while the poem's third and central stanza extends to 4 lines. The first and fourth stanzas, which employ the refrain "I have known rivers," have 2 lines. This pattern creates a kind of structural symmetry. much as in a blues song, for which Hughes is famous. In general, the poem's flowing, variable, free verse lines allow Hughes to find a poetic expression of the historical complexity of the Black experience. In the absence of a set meter, the poem's rhythms flow like a river, sometimes accelerating and finding a groove, sometimes slowing down, becoming languorous and luxurious. The poem not only describes rivers, it imitates their distinctive rhythms in the way they flow. The speaker of the Negro speaks of rivers is represented as a representative figure. The poem's title, after all, is The Negro Speaks of Rivers rather than A Negro. The speaker is a model for the entire black community. The speaker shows how the community can or should relate to its own history, its traumas, and its triumphs. The speaker's relationship to that history is deep and continuous. He or she was present for the earliest moments of human history, bathing in the Euphrates, a river in the Fertile Crescent, where human civilization began when dawns were young. But the speaker also heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to the New Orleans, a reference to a trip that the future president Lincoln took as a young man, which exposed him to the evils of slavery. The speaker's experience comprehends the very ancient to the very recent. Further, it includes the triumphs of black culture, like the construction of the pyramids, alongside its greatest trauma, slavery in America. The speaker's experience suggests several things at once. First, that the black people have been key participants in human civilization and that their contributions should not be ignored. Second, that black culture is strong and resilient. Resilient enough to overcome the traumas of slavery, which cut off the black people from their families, their traditions, and their countries. As a representative figure, then the speaker suggests that the black community should take pride in this vibrancy and resilience, turning to its history as a source of identity in the form of racism. The setting of the Negro speaks of rivers over the course of the first 10 lines moves across the whole breadth of human history and much of the earth's geography. The poem's setting is thus broad as the human history itself, stretching from its very earliest moments to its recent past. And as its setting is as wide as the black people's presence occurrence across the globe, from the Middle East to Africa, from Africa to the Americas, this broad variety of people and times becomes part of poem's point that black culture is vibrant, continuous, and accomplished. The speaker thinks that the black people should take pride in his history. Historians should not ignore or disgrace it. Talking about the literary context of the poem, Langston Hughes wrote The Negro Speaks of River when he was only 17 years old. According to a legend, the legend that Hughes promotes, he was taking a train from St. Louis to Mexico City to visit his father. When the train crossed the Mississippi, inspiration struck and the poem poured out. Whether the story is true or not, the poem quickly becomes one of the most famous documents from the Harlem Renaissance, a literary movement that flourished in the 1920s in Harlem, a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan. In articulating black experience, the Negro speaks of rivers. Hughes rejects many of the central traditions of English poetry like meter and rhyme. Those traditions are often associated with the white Europeans. Instead, the poem tries to develop a distinctly black literary voice to express the distinctiveness of black culture. Because it stretches from the dawn of human history to American slavery, the Negro Speaks of Rivers has an extremely broad historical context. Indeed, its context might be said to be human history itself. In engaging such a broad context, the poem challenges the dominant historical narratives of its times. These narratives were assembled by white historians and tended to ignore or slight the accomplishments of the black people in human history. Indeed, the German philosopher Hegel claimed in his Philosophy of History, 1837, that the African continent, and by extension the black people, were simply outside the human history, and that they did not contribute in any way to the political or cultural development of human society. This poem of Langston Hughes asks its readers to reconsider that history and to recognize the centrality of black people in human history and culture. One of the key challenges facing the black community was to reconstruct a sense of identity, to reclaim the parts of its history that had been destroyed or obscured by slavery. The Negro Speaks of Rivers attempts to answer this challenge by presenting a speaker whose experience includes slavery but also stretches far beyond it. The Negro Speaks of Rivers is fully enriched with the symbolism of rivers, human body, and soul. When the speaker of the Negro Speaks of Rivers first mentions rivers in the poem's opening line, they seem like literal things, actually bodies of waters. However, as the poem progresses, the rivers gradually accumulate symbolic weight. Sure, they are real rivers, but they also stand in metonymically for the cultures that they have risen and fallen on their banks, from the ancient Sumerian culture that flourished among the Euphrates to the slave culture of the American South. In this sense, each individual river the poem mentioned serves as a symbol or a metonym for those cultures. More broadly, the rivers themselves come to serve as symbols for human history. This symbolism reveals important things about the speaker's consideration, understanding of the history. Rivers are continuous and unbroken. They cannot be chopped into discrete parts. The speaker understands history in similar terms as a continuous experience that stretches from the distant past into the present. In turn, this mentions that black identity is not defined by the traumas it has suffered under slavery, the Jim Crow laws, and American racism. Instead, black identity stretches across these traumas into the distant past to cultures and traditions that the slave trade interrupted. As symbols, the rivers thus present a fundamentally hopeful view of black culture. It is strong and powerful enough to survive the traumas of slavery, connecting the black people to a past they might otherwise have irreparably lost. Human body is the second interesting symbol that is presented in the poem. In line 2, the speaker describes the rivers that he or she has known as older than the flow of human blood and human veins. I quote from the text. In this case, the blood serves as a symbol or synecdoche for human beings themselves. In other words, the speaker is saying that the rivers are older than the humans as a species. The symbol raises an interesting possibility which complicates the way the poem talks about the rivers. Elsewhere in the poem, rivers serve as metonyms for particular human cultures. More broadly, they symbolize human history itself. But here, the speaker suggests that the rivers should not be simply or exclusively associated with human culture. In fact, they exist far beyond and before the human beings themselves and the human bodies. As a symbol, then, human blood in human veins indicates the limits of humanity. It suggests that the things the poem describes have an existence beyond their participation in the human culture. In turn, this seems to grant the speaker a sense of wisdom and peace, causing his or her soul grow deep. From the body, the poem takes us into the soul of the world or the cosmos. In lines 3 and 10, the speaker claims that his or her soul has grown deep like the rivers. In a sense, this is the poem's key claim. It suggests that the speaker has internalized the deep history and experience that the rivers embody, a history that stretches all the way to the dawn of human civilization. The speaker's soul thus takes on unusual characteristics. But the speaker's soul in the poem seems much grander and broader than it. It encompasses not only the speaker's individual life, but the whole history of black culture. The speaker's use of the word soul in the lines 3 and 10 thus serves not only as a reference to his or her personal experience, it also represents the experience and identity of the speaker's culture. In other words, it serves as a symbol of the entire culture. The figures of speech that I discussed in the poem include the imagery and the rest. Imagery is used to make readers perceive things involving their five senses. For example, I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep is a beautiful expression of the imagery. Ancient dusky rivers and seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset from the poem could be understood to create wonderful imagery of the human civilization. These lines enable the readers to literally perceive the hut and sleep, symbolic of calmness of life, on the Congo River basin, and the dusk and mud of slavery, with a golden sunset of a bright future of equality and abolition of slavery, thus continuing the theme of the poem further. Personification is an important figure of speech that is used in the poem. Personification means to give human attributes to inanimate objects. The river Mississippi is personified. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, as if the river is human that can sing. The simile that is used in the poem also is worth mentioning as a figure of speech. Simile is a figure of speech used to compare an object or a person with something else to make the meanings clearer to the readers. There are two similes that are used in this poem. The first example, I have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. In this line, the poet compares the rivers with the ancient world. The second example is in the third line, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. Here, the depth of his soul is compared to the depth of the rivers. Assonance is the repetition of the vowel sounds in the same line, such as the sound of O, as you see in my soul has grown deep like the rivers, to create the musicality of the poem. Anaphora refers to the repetition of a word or expression in the first part of the some verses. For example, I have known rivers in the opening lines of the poem to express his knowledge of the ancient culture before the slavery period. The poem also has got the refrains, which means the lines repeated at some distance in the poems. The phrase I have known rivers is repeated and has become a refrain. So, students, this poem is written from the perspective of an old soul who tries to establish a link between the past and the present. The poet uses rivers as symbols to reflect the African experience and history. Additionally, he says that his soul is as deep as a river, implying he has seen and experienced tremendous changes in his civilization. Also, he speaks about his past activities near the Euphrates, the Congo River, the Nile River, which provide a clue to his philosophical approach, love of nature, and the origin of human race. Thus, the poet in the Negro speaks of rivers as our speaker charts and heritage of Black Americans, beginning with the cradle of the civilization in the Middle East and ending with the references to slavery as seen from the Mississippi River. But he also is optimistic because he ends his poem by showing that it glows like the sun, expressing a positive view of the end of slavery on the American soil. Thus, he traces over 4,000 years of human history and ends the poem with a positive note of equality and democracy. I hope you have enjoyed the poem and its explanation. Listen to it again for a proper understanding. Thank you very much for having a patient listening. Bye for now.